You are small enough that the guards lift you with one hand, as if you weigh nothing more than a clay jar. Their sandals echo against the limestone floor, while torches spit and tremble against the walls, painting monstrous shadows that stretch into eternity. The air reeks of cedar oil, perfume masking the sour stench of fear. From beyond the door ahead, you hear muffled cries, high-pitched, broken, quickly silenced. The eunuchs glance at you but say nothing, their eyes dulled by decades of obedience. The bronze doors groan open, and there he sits, Pharaoh Pepi II. His throne is massive, carved with falcons and gods, yet the boy upon it is smaller than you imagined. Bare feet swing above the step, but his gaze burns with a hunger that stops your breath. This is no child. This is Egypt's eternal ruler, a god in flesh whose whims are law. And tonight, you are not the first to be dragged into these chambers. You are one of countless offerings in a nightly ritual that outlived entire generations. For while Egypt's pyramids soared toward heaven, its throne room hid a truth darker than the desert night. If this glimpse into forgotten shadows grips you, I invite you to subscribe and share in the comments where you're listening from, because every name in the thread becomes part of our community, a gathering of witnesses willing to confront what history tried to bury. Egypt's old kingdom dazzled the world with stone pyramids that defied death and kings who claimed eternity. But beneath the splendor was something colder, a bureaucracy so precise it could catalog human lives as offerings, ledger lines stacked beside taxes of grain and cattle. Pepi II, the boy who ruled for 94 years, the longest reign recorded in history, turned indulgence into system, cruelty into policy. Chroniclers whispered it. Tomb inscriptions hinted at it. Archaeologists uncovered traces that no perfume of myth can disguise. Tonight we piece them together, not as legend, but as the terrifying mosaic of truth. The child who became pharaoh was never meant to be ordinary. Pepi II came to the throne when he was barely 6 years old, the last scion of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for centuries. His mother, Pepi II, served as regent, guiding his fragile hand across decrees while priests declared him divine. To the common people, he was a living god. But behind the incense and ceremony, a dangerous truth began to take root. A boy with unchecked power was taught that his desires, however unnatural, were not only permissible, they were sacred. The court around him understood the rules. Egypt was an empire of order, where every harvest was weighed, every worker recorded, every offering tallied. The same system that measured grain and cattle soon extended its reach into the most intimate corners of human life. Children, women, and slaves were no longer individuals. They became entries in a ledger, commodities to be delivered as tributes to the throne. One relief in a tomb near Saqqara depicts long lines of bound captives brought from Nubia, their hands tied behind them. The inscription does not bother with names. Instead, it boasts of 100 boys and girls of pleasing form, presented as gifts to Pharaoh. The word pleasing appears again and again in Old Kingdom records, a chilling euphemism that historians believe masked a darker reality. These children were not honored guests, they were playthings in the palace of a boy god. Contemporary chroniclers whisper that Pepi II developed an obsession with boys. In one infamous account, he was said to command naked slaves smeared with honey to amuse him, allowing insects to feast on their flesh while he watched. Whether literal or exaggerated, the persistence of the story across centuries tells us something vital. The reputation of Pepi II was entwined with cruelty and perversity from the beginning. Egypt's grandeur could not completely conceal its rot. Imagine the psychological warfare of such a court. Mothers forced to stand by as their children were chosen for companionship to Pharaoh. Fathers watching daughters taken not as wives or servants, but as trophies. The palace called them companions of play, an innocent phrase hiding systematic exploitation. Officials, desperate to secure favor, scoured conquered territories for the most beautiful children, recording them in tribute lists alongside ivory tusks and exotic animals. The cold arithmetic of empire did not distinguish between a herd of cattle and a group of terrified teenagers. Archaeologists excavating storage rooms near pyramid complexes have found graffiti etched into the walls. Desperate marks scratched by hands too small to belong to soldiers or masons. Some are simple names, others crude drawings of ships, suggesting that children taken from Nubia or the Levant clung to memories of their homes even as they awaited their fate. These traces, silent for thousands of years, remind us that beneath every statistic was a human being, frightened, resisting erasure in the only way they could. But the cruelty was not only in the abductions, it was in the deliberate severing of identity. Captives were stripped of their names, given new designations tied to Pharaoh. Some were forced into ceremonial roles, dancing before the court, singing hymns, serving at banquets, mock performances of joy, masking a reality of bondage. Others were used in darker rituals, their bodies instruments of both power and humiliation. Chroniclers note that Pepi II's favorites were often displayed publicly, a twisted reminder that the god-king's desires ruled over all. This was not chaos. It was systematic. Each tribute cycle was timed with precision, matching the rhythms of the Nile and the demands of Pharaoh's palace. Commanders earned bonuses for delivering human cargo in excellent condition. In some seasons, entire villages were emptied. Their children marched across the desert under armed guard. Mortality on these forced journeys could reach staggering levels, yet records describe the dead in the same tone as spoiled grain, acceptable losses. To the empire, their suffering was nothing more than a calculation. Even within Egypt itself, fear rippled through households. Some families resorted to desperate measures to protect their children. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletal remains with deliberate deformities, limbs broken and poorly healed, suggesting that parents crippled their own sons and daughters to make them undesirable to the collectors. In villages along the Nile, oral traditions preserved stories of mothers smearing ash on their daughters' faces, hiding them in granaries when royal emissaries arrived. These were acts of love, but also of despair, born from the knowledge that Pharaoh's appetite was insatiable. The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical. Imagine being a child torn from your family, forced to watch as priests intoned that this was not cruelty, but divine order. The gods demanded your obedience. Pharaoh was not a man, but a god, his will eternal. To resist was blasphemy. This religious framing turned abuse into ritual, suffering into sacrament. It was psychological warfare perfected at an industrial scale, breaking spirits as effectively as chains. The grandeur of Egypt concealed it well. Tourists in later centuries marveled at temples, columns, and pyramids, seeing only eternity carved in stone. But if they had walked the palace corridors at night, they might have heard the muffled cries, the whispered orders, the laughter of a boy god presiding over torments. And all of it recorded, not in novels or legends, but in ledgers and reliefs, preserved with the same bureaucratic care as taxes and harvests. What began as the whims of a child, Pharaoh hardened into a system. Every year of Pepi II's reign, the machinery ground on. Victims were sorted, categorized, transported. Some never reached the palace, their bodies discarded in the desert. Others lived, but only as hollow shadows of themselves, reduced to roles assigned by priests and scribes. Over decades, the system became self-sustaining, a machine that consumed generation after generation. And as Pepi II grew older, his desires did not soften. They deepened, becoming more elaborate, more theatrical, more cruel. The boy god who once swung his legs from the throne now ruled as an old man, yet the nightly rituals continued. The empire around him faltered, famine struck, provinces broke away. But inside the palace, the machinery of perversion ground on. For the pharaoh's pleasure was eternal, and the system that fed it was as enduring as the pyramids themselves. The deeper one looks into Pepi II's reign, the more apparent it becomes that this was not simply the corruption of a single ruler, it was the entrenchment of a culture where cruelty became routine. Egypt, famed for its order, its law, and its celestial balance, transformed intimacy into another commodity. The pharaoh's desires seeped into every chamber of bureaucracy, as if the Nile itself had been redirected to feed his appetite. Tribute lists from Nubia, Canaan, and Libya reveal more than just conquest. They record youths of the south, maidens of pleasing appearance, and dwarfs for delight. Each entry is written in the same tone as ivory or ebony, stripping away the humanity of those delivered into bondage. Inscriptions near Aswan describe local leaders forced to offer their own sons and daughters, a ritual humiliation meant to remind them that their lineage itself was at Pharaoh's disposal. This was not chaos, it was deliberate psychological warfare. For every captive who arrived in Memphis or at the pyramid complexes, the process was chillingly systematic. Children were inspected, categorized, and renamed. Official scribes created rosters where human beings were divided into groups: singers, dancers, play companions, attendants. Beside each group were notes about condition, age, and expected years of service, like livestock tallies in an abattoir. 15 females, aged 16 to 20, excellent condition, one record notes, placed on the same line as a shipment of myrrh and copper. But not all were destined for the palace. Many were redistributed to high officials, gifts from the throne. Pepi II's indulgence became a currency, traded among the elite. Archaeologists working near Abydos found stelae depicting nobles boasting not of grain stores or military victories, but of the number of foreign boys and girls granted to them by Pharaoh. These were not private crimes, hidden in shame. They were rewards, flaunted publicly as markers of status. This normalization spread fear far beyond the palace walls. In Nubia, oral traditions speak of villages abandoning their riverbanks to flee into the desert whenever Egyptian scouts appeared. In Canaan, parents disfigured their children, cutting scars across their faces, hoping the collectors would overlook them. The terror of abduction rippled across generations, reshaping entire societies. To this day, folk tales survive of a boy king, whose gaze could strip families of their children, a memory fossilized in story, long after Egypt's stones began to crumble. The suffering did not end with capture. Transport was itself a crucible of despair. Children marched across desert roads in chains, crammed into barges along the Nile, packed into ships bound for the capital. Mortality was staggering: heat, thirst, disease. But the losses were recorded coldly: 15 gone, 30 remain, as if the dead were spoiled goods. To Pharaoh's officials, these were acceptable losses, part of the cost of feeding an empire's appetites. Archaeologists have uncovered mass graves near river ports, bodies of adolescents hastily buried, unceremoniously discarded like broken amphorae. Inside the palace, survival was its own torment. Some were forced into perpetual performance, singing hymns, dancing in ceremonies, pretending to rejoice at their fate. Others were broken into servitude, silenced by threats and punishments. Punishments were theatrical, designed to instill terror. A single disobedience might see a child stripped, beaten, and displayed before the court as a living warning. Chroniclers describe Pepi II, laughing as servants were tormented with insects, honey smeared on their skin. Whether apocryphal or not, the fact that such tales clung to his memory tells us that cruelty was part of his legend, preserved even by those who despised him. What makes Pepi II's reign more horrifying is its scale in time. He ruled for 94 years, the longest reign in recorded history. Imagine a system of perversion sustained not for a generation, not for a lifetime, but for almost a century. Children captured in his early years grew old and died, only to be replaced by their grandchildren, drawn into the same machinery. Whole bloodlines vanished into Pharaoh's chambers, swallowed by an institution that outlived them. And still, the ledgers were kept. Surviving fragments track pregnancy cycles of palace women, noting births with the same detached precision as the hatching of geese. Officials wrote of increased productivity, as if breeding humans for Pharaoh's service were no different than expanding a herd of cattle. Euphemisms cloaked the horror: companions of joy, keepers of the heart, gifts of the South. Yet each phrase was a mask for lives consumed and discarded. Resistance, when it came, was desperate and often futile. Some mothers killed their children rather than see them taken. A papyrus fragment from Elephantine tells of a woman executed after drowning her daughter to keep her from Pharaoh's collectors. To the state, it was treason. To her, it was mercy. Acts like this echo across cultures, repeated wherever exploitation becomes systemic. They remind us that behind every statistic is a human heart willing to break itself to resist annihilation. The longer Pepi II reigned, the more hollow Egypt became. Resources drained into palace excess. Provinces grew restless. The economy faltered. Famines swept the land, but still tribute lists recorded boys and girls delivered to the throne. Priests declared that Pharaoh's desires were divine commands, even as the empire crumbled under the weight of his indulgence. By the end of his reign, the Old Kingdom itself began to collapse into what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a century of chaos and fragmentation. In this sense, Pepi II's excesses were not just personal sins, they were catalysts for civilizational ruin. And yet, in the ruins, the victims remain silent witnesses. The pyramid built for Pepi II, once a monument to eternity, is today little more than rubble, eroded and forgotten. His name is barely remembered outside the annals of Egyptology. But the faint etchings in storage rooms, the graffiti of ships scratched by trembling hands, the skeletal remains of children buried hastily along desert roads, these are his true legacy. They speak louder than stone. It is here, in this silence, that the true weight of Pepi II's reign becomes clear. He was not merely a boy who indulged himself. He was the center of a machine that converted innocence into currency, humanity into ritual, intimacy into terror. A machine that operated with cold precision, overseen by scribes, priests, and officials who hid behind euphemisms and bureaucracy. A machine so vast that it spanned nearly a century, leaving scars that outlasted the empire itself. And as the empire crumbled, the question lingered like a curse. What happens when power is given to a child and worshipped as a god? Egypt gave us the answer. It becomes eternal hunger, a system of perversion written into the very stones of civilization. By the time Pepi II had grown from boy to man, Egypt was no longer ruled by kingship in the old sense. It was ruled by appetite. The machinery of exploitation had matured alongside him, adapting to his whims with chilling precision. What began as the indulgence of a child had calcified into policy, ritual, and culture, an empire's central nervous system wired to satisfy the desires of one man. The most haunting element of this system was its cyclical nature. Victims were not only consumed, they were transformed into instruments of further consumption. Captives who survived long enough often became overseers of the newly arrived, forced to sort children, to break them into obedience, to perpetuate the very cruelties that had destroyed them. This was psychological warfare at its purest. To survive, one had to become complicit. Entire generations learned to equate survival with betrayal, creating a cycle that could continue indefinitely without Pharaoh ever lifting his hand. The bureaucracy only deepened this cruelty. Officials devised what modern historians call breeding registers. Palace women, many taken as children themselves, were monitored for pregnancies, their fertility tracked like agricultural yields. Births were celebrated not as miracles, but as additions to Pharaoh's stock, calculated into ledgers that already balanced grain, cattle, and slaves. It is difficult to overstate the coldness of these records. One papyrus fragment notes a birth in the same line as the delivery of fish oil, both resources, both consumable, and there was spectacle. Pepi II's reign is remembered for stories so grotesque they sound like inventions of his enemies, yet they echo across sources. Chroniclers describe him smearing captives in honey and releasing them into courtyards, delighting as swarms of insects devoured them. Others tell of victims paraded before the court, mocked and humiliated before their destruction. Whether literal or symbolic, these accounts reveal a truth: cruelty had become entertainment, normalized not just for Pharaoh, but for the elite who watched and applauded. Justice, too, was perverted. Legal codes treated sexual violation not as a crime against a person, but as property damage. A girl taken was not recognized as a victim, but as an item stolen from her family, her worth reduced to compensation in livestock or silver. In the palace, even this thin veneer of justice vanished. There, Pharaoh's will erased all boundaries. To be chosen was not a matter of legality. It was divine decree, unchallengeable by any mortal. And still, the system expanded. Tribute cycles were timed with the Nile's flood, scouts dispatched in seasonal raids across Nubia, Canaan, and the desert fringes. Maps were drawn not only for military strategy, but for human inventory, marking villages known to yield valuable captives. Commanders received bonuses measured in human bodies, their promotions tied to how efficiently they fed Pharaoh's hunger. Conquest was not about territory, It was about supply chains for flesh. Pause and consider this. Entire towns surrendered without a fight at the mere whisper of what awaited their daughters and sons if they resisted. Pepi II did not need to raise armies in every corner of his empire. Fear itself did the work. It was industrial-scale dehumanization, perfected not on battlefields but in the minds of terrified subjects. And so Egypt became a paradox. Outwardly, it displayed monuments of eternal order, pyramids, temples, hieroglyphs carved with promises of balance and harmony. Yet beneath that stone mask lay a society where cruelty was institutionalized, bureaucracy and ritual turned into weapons of domination. The god-king had achieved something more enduring than conquest of land. He had conquered intimacy itself, reshaping the very fabric of human bonds into tools of control. The longer Pepi II reigned, the more absolute his appetites became. 94 years on the throne meant that no one alive remembered in Egypt without him. Entire lifetimes unfolded beneath his shadow, and within that span, cruelty was no longer shocking. It was ordinary. What began as whispers became accepted fact. Pharaoh's hunger was as inevitable as the flood of the Nile. But when cruelty becomes ordinary, it becomes corrosive. Egypt's resources, once marshaled for building pyramids and feeding provinces, drained instead into maintaining the palace machine. Famine struck during the later years of his reign, the Nile failing to flood as expected, harvests dwindling. Villages starved, yet tribute lists still recorded children and servants delivered to the throne. The machinery of exploitation did not pause even as the land around it withered. Pharaoh's desires were eternal, even if his people's grain ran out. This contradiction eroded the empire's very foundations. Provinces began to rebel, withholding tribute, appointing their own leaders. The powerful nomarchs' provincial governors realized that loyalty to a decaying center was a death sentence. And yet, even as Egypt fractured, Pepi II clung to the rituals of indulgence, a king more preoccupied with nightly companions than with the disintegration of his realm. Historians note that this collapse into the first intermediate period was not sudden. It was gradual, like rot spreading through timber. Corruption in the palace infected officials across the country. Records from provincial tombs reveal local lords imitating Pharaoh's practices, boasting of youths of Nubia or maidens of the south in their households. The sickness had spread. What was once the whim of a boy god had metastasized into a culture of systemic dehumanization. And yet, perhaps the most chilling revelation is how normalized this became. For nearly a century, generations of Egyptians grew up believing that this was the natural order of the universe, that Pharaoh's whims were divine law, that children taken as tribute were simply part of life. When cruelty lasts long enough, it ceases to be cruelty. It becomes tradition. This was Pepi II's true legacy, not just the suffering he inflicted, but the acceptance of that suffering as natural, even sacred. Still, beneath the stone mask of acceptance, resistance smoldered. Oral traditions from Nubia tell of parents who mutilated their children to protect them from collectors. In Canaan, whole villages fled deeper into hills, abandoning farmland to escape raids. And within Egypt, some officials quietly defied decrees, hiding captives or recording false numbers to shield the vulnerable. These acts were small, fleeting, and often punished with death. Yet they remind us that even in the darkest machinery, sparks of humanity flickered. As Pepi II aged into decrepitude, the empire itself seemed to mirror him, hollowed, brittle, exhausted. His pyramid, built smaller and cheaper than his predecessors, was already crumbling by the time of his death. The wealth and order that had sustained Egypt's old kingdom disintegrated with him, leaving behind only fragments, ruined provinces, starving villages, broken trust in the divine kingship. The machinery that had consumed children for nearly a century ultimately consumed the state itself. And so the paradox closes. The boy who was crowned as a god and ruled longer than any monarch in history also presided over the collapse of one of humanity's greatest civilizations. His indulgence outlived his glory. His desires devoured not only the innocent, but the empire itself. Pause and consider that legacy. The stones of his pyramid lie in ruin, forgotten beneath the sands. But the scars remain, in oral traditions, in skeletal remains, in graffiti scratched by trembling hands. Pepi II achieved a form of immortality, not through monuments, but through infamy. For his reign proves a truth that echoes across all empires. When power is worshipped without restraint, it will devour not only its victims but the very civilization that feeds it. The sands of Egypt have long since buried Pepi II's palace, his voice silenced by millennia. His pyramid, once a beacon of eternity, now lies crumbled and forgotten, little more than rubble scattered by the desert winds. But his true legacy endures in forms far harder to erase, the scars of a century where innocence was systematically consumed and humanity itself was converted into a resource. When we remember Egypt, we are taught to see pyramids and golden masks, the splendor of Ra's chosen kings. But beneath that glittering image lies a darker truth, that even the mightiest civilization can normalize the unthinkable when power is unchecked. Pepi II's reign was not simply the perversion of one man. It was a society rearranged around that perversion, an entire machine built to serve his appetite, its gears turning through bureaucracy, religion, and ritual. And though the centuries have passed, the echoes remain. Anthropologists trace genetic imprints of Nubian, Levantine, and Libyan captives within Egyptian remains. Folktales from the south still whisper of the boy king who stole children by divine right. Inscriptions carved by trembling hands still survive in storerooms and tombs, silent graffiti that speaks louder than monuments. These fragments remind us that the victims were not erased completely, that their existence still resists the silence of history. The collapse of Egypt's old kingdom teaches another lesson: cruelty does not sustain power, it corrodes it. Pepi II's century of indulgence weakened Egypt from within, emptying its granaries, fracturing its provinces, poisoning its faith in kingship. The boy who reigned forever left behind not glory, but ruin. His reign demonstrates that power wielded as appetite devours itself, as surely as fire consumes the wood that feeds it. As we close this descent into the forgotten shadows of history, we must remember, these were not just statistics or hieroglyphs on a wall. They were children with names, mothers with love, fathers with fear. They were people who sang, laughed, prayed, and dreamed until a system stripped them of identity and made them instruments of terror. To speak their story now is to return a fragment of dignity that was denied them in life. If this history unsettled you, subscribe and share in the comments what struck you most, because the more we remember, the less power the shadows of history have to repeat themselves. Together, we confront what was buried. Together, we give voice to those silenced by eternity. And so Pepi II stands, not as the eternal god he claimed to be, but as a warning that unchecked power does not build pyramids of glory. It builds prisons of fear, monuments of suffering, and legacies of ruin.